In this video, I try out 3 different driver tips which massively increased my driver distance from this to this. In fact, after implementing these tips, my average driver distance went from around 210 to 220 all the way up to about 260 to 270, a 50-yard increase. I've put these tips in the order that made the biggest impact for me, with the biggest improvement coming from tip number 3. But that being said, all 3 of these tips led to the improvement we just saw. So tip number 1 was from Maude, who said something I'd never really heard anyone say before.
Nice and fast and hard, downwards towards the ground. Not what most people are doing, by the way, trying to rotate. Rotation is a killer for golf swings. You see the best players rotating, but they do it naturally. It's their response to them throwing the club down to the ground that pushes the hip open. That is how we get open.
The concept that the rotation in the swing comes naturally as a result of throwing the club down at the ball as hard as possible. This makes perfect sense in theory, and we probably all do this naturally anyway, but I honestly had no idea if this is something I already do, or if I do indeed intentionally try to rotate. So here I was trying to fire my hands and arms first, and just let my body follow and rotate by itself. Now you can already see quite a big improvement here, however, not all of my shots came out like this. Using this swing thought did lead to several other problems, namely poor face contact and in some cases a lower club head speed, which I think was caused by me concentrating too much on my arms and my hands and not enough on my lower body and the weight shift that ultimately generates a lot of speed. It's definitely a helpful tip to have in the back of the mind, but I think the bigger message is just to not focus so much on the rotating rather than the weight shift and the arm movement as a whole. The rotation does indeed happen naturally, so you don't really need to think about it too much, but that doesn't mean that the only thing you should be thinking about is getting your arms down to the ball as quickly as possible, because quite counterintuitively that will result in a slower, less powerful shot. Tip number 2 is from Mark Crossfield, and he says,
let's pretend I want to hit this wall as hard as possible. I was trying to do it in a way where I go almost ahead of the wall and then try and line things up back here to get my face square and those kind of ideas to hit target. So I was doing a lot of adjustments to try and get back. It wasn't about speed. If I was going to knock this wall down, which I'm not going to do because I haven't got the strength, if I was going to try to, I would be going back here to be going this way to hit this back of the ball, back of the wall. And my lead leg to do that is basically really posting up. I'm not going beyond like you saw in that first video.
So here I am really trying to emphasize that push sensation with my lead leg. That is where the power lies. That is the movement that whips the club at the low point of the swing, giving it the most momentum. You can see again that this has also led to an increase in distance slightly, as I'm generating more power and a higher club head speed. I actually turned on the club speed data point on the TrackMan here, and you can see that this shot was just over 103 miles per hour, which is apparently the average driver swing speed for someone who's a 5 handicap, and that's certainly much better than I am, and this swing speed is much faster than the average for my particular handicap. Danny also says in his video that the way he usually works with clients is to first prioritize distance over everything and getting the real fundamentals of the technique down without really worrying too much about where the ball goes. Then once they can comfortably hit the ball with a decent swing speed, they can dial it back to make the shots a bit more precise. I had many shots here that were indeed quite far off the centre, but we can address that in a future video, so make sure you're subscribed if you don't want to miss it. Tip number 3 is from none other than Mr. Rick Shields.
Hitting irons and wedges. You want to try and create width, ideally as much width as you can. And what width means is, imagine this, the centre of my chest here. As I start to turn and move the club away, my objective here is not to sway too much to the side. However, I want to try and keep the gap between my club head and the middle of my chest as wide as possible. That's width there, as far away from my chest as I possibly can. Obviously that's done with my arms and the way I've turned my torso, but if we can create that width early in the swing, it sets you up for creating power. Now if I was hitting, let's say, an iron shot or a wedge shot, you'd probably see a little bit more of a takeaway where the wrist would hinge a little bit more, my arms maybe a little bit closer to my body, and you can see there, the gap between my head and my chest is not as big. It's great for controlled shots. Let's be honest, we're hitting drivers. We want speed and power, right?
Again, this is not something that I think I've ever heard before, and I'm almost certain that in my normal driver shots, I do hinge my wrists quite a bit, because that's just what I've learned to do with my irons, and I think I've just assumed that that's the same thing that you should be doing with your driver, even though I know that the driver swing is very different to the swing with your irons. But this is one thing I hadn't quite appreciated until I watched Rick's video. So in these next shots, I'm going to try to create as much width as possible, extending my hands out as far from my body as possible and trying not to hinge the club too much. Now, I said I ordered these golf tips from least to most effective, and that's because I noticed that straight away with this tip, it added distance without compromising any accuracy or any other parts of the swing itself. It's such a simple thing to implement if you're not already doing it, so really no reason not to.